So let's see if that helped. Can you guys, Emily, let's start with you. Can you just give us your name and the title of your book again?
All right, so we are live. We got it.
I'm E.M. Wright, and my book's title is Sedition.
All right, Chris?
I'm Chris Patrick Carolyn, author of The Nightshade Cabal.
And Clayton?
Clayton Snyder, author of The Infernal Machine.
Okay, you are able to hear everybody now. So I guess that means we're going to have to start all over again. I'm really sorry for the inconvenience, you guys. And thank you for bearing with us, audience members. Conveniently, this will be recorded and put on our YouTube video later, where I can very effectively just cut that whole first part of silent talking. So now that we've had a rehearsal, let's go into the real deal. My name is Mallory Nilsson. Again, I am the blog director at the Parliament House Press. I am here with Emily Wright, Clayton Snyder, and Chris Patrick Carolyn, going to talk about steampunk and all of their novels that incorporate the steampunk aesthetic and all of that good stuff. So let's start with you, Chris. Can you please go ahead and introduce the Nightshade Cabal and tell us a little bit about it?
Sure. I'm Chris Patrick Carolyn, author of The Nightshade Cabal. It's my first novel, which was released earlier this year by Parliament House Press. It's a paranormal steampunk murder mystery set in 1880s Halifax. Kind of blends urban fantasy elements with steampunk, so it's a bit of magic, a bit of steampunk high-tech, dead bodies all over the place, cyborgs, bad breakfasts. It's a lot of fun, I think. So there we go.
Perfect. That sounds like a lot of fun. And Emily, how about you tell us about Sedition, coming out in 2021?
My debut novel, Sedition, is a YA steampunk novel that follows a Clockwork Cyborg who has to hide what she is in order to survive, and what happens when she's discovered by a privateer and her journey there. And it's sort of a story about finding yourself and learning to deal with a world that doesn't want you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And then Clayton, last but not least, can you please tell us a little bit about the Infernal Machine?
Yes, The Infernal Machine was it's kind of a crossover, similar to Chris's novel. It's a crossover between occult and steampunk stuff. I wanted to talk about the burden of regret when you're immortal, what that's like, and the things you have to deal with that pile up over those lifetimes. So
awesome, thank you. So yeah, let's just move right back into it. So I'm going to ask you all to define give me your definition of steampunk again. So Emily, let's again start with you. How do you personally define steampunk?
Steampunk is a longing for a world that never really existed, a history that never was, and it's an exploration of Victorian aesthetic with futuristic technology. I think that's sort of what it's about.
I know I'm asking you to have some recall of what we've already done, but thank you. That was great. And Chris, let's move to you. Can you give me your definition of steampunk?
Yeah, the definition that I go by is yesterday's tomorrow that never was. So it's an exploration of future technology, retrofuturism in a way, future technology of a bygone era, usually Victorian, mostly centered in the Victorian period of Britain, or in my case, the British colonies of North America, so Halifax, Nova Scotia, by the time I was setting my story. But it's not always necessarily Victorian era Earth that these stories are set in. It can be an exploration of alternate worlds in a lot of ways.
Awesome, yeah, and I just want to reiterate that I am so glad that you brought in that element, that it doesn't necessarily have to be Earth or our reality, our history that we're drawing from to project that forward into a future so that we can have a different perspective. So that was great. Thank you. And Clayton, for you, what is your definition of steampunk?
Steampunk for me is again, at its core, it's about kicking back against class and society norms. It's about kind of leveling the playing field for everybody.
Yeah, I think that's really cool, because there is a lot of attention paid to the aesthetic of steampunk, and sometimes that is at the expense of the sort of political or class struggle that can be at the heart of it. So let's just move in to a next question from here. We're going to do it a little bit differently, since that ended up a bit differently. Actually, let's just move right back into that question I asked previously. So steampunk can be described as a historical reenactment of a future that never was. So not only taking on a historical aesthetic with a futuristic twist, but also potentially utilizing the way that we approach telling historical stories and applying that to a non-existent future. I'm thinking about this in contrast to science fiction, which uses the language of a projected future to talk about potential realities. So do you utilize steampunk as a narrative device as well as an aesthetic one? And I'll go back to you, Clayton, because you talked about this a little bit, how you focused more on the narrative device element. So for you specifically, how do you incorporate the aesthetic, and how do you find balance there?
Yeah, and in the Infernal Machine, the idea is that the people that are using the steampunk technology are typically the people with power. And it's not used to the kindest means, the kindest ends. And there's that again, there's that kind of wielding of class and privilege in order to harm other people. So it's definitely, there's that struggle in the long term between what's right and what works, I guess sometimes.
Okay,
Yeah.
for sure. And as you're talking about this, it kind of reminds me a little bit of the themes that were dealt with in like Blade Runner, how the upper class has all of this access to technology and these replicants. In your case, it's some like a Clockwork Heart. There's things centered around that, and how that gives them a position of privilege over the lower class that don't have access to that technology. Would you say that it's sort of like a similar experience?
Yeah, and the heart is a perfect example. In that case, Arthur is literally chained to Mr. Black because he is tied to him via this heart. He's constantly having these chemicals pumped into his body that are more or less making him obedient to the man. In addition to, granted there are somewhat benefits, I guess, without serious air quotes there, but he's got this immortality, but at the same time he is definitely tied to being to being Mr. Black's underling, for lack of a better word.
For sure. And Chris,
sorry.
No, go right ahead. I thought you were finished.
I was gonna say, it's certainly wielded as a cudgel the way Mr. Black handles it. So.
Yeah, I think that in your blurb you actually call it a burden. So like you go into your story knowing that it is a burden. It's not a pleasant experience for Arthur.
Right.
And so, like, Chris, let's move over to you. Same question. So do you utilize steampunk as a narrative device as well as an aesthetic one in your storytelling?
I certainly try to, and I think what we're talking about here, actually, what with this question we're talking about, and especially Clayton's answer, I think we're talking about the punk part of steampunk, because it is two words mashed together, and I think the steam talks about the technology parts, but the punk part of steampunk talks about the social aspects of the genre that we're talking about. But in my book, in the Nightshade Cabal, I don't necessarily address it in terms of the technology. But in my book, because it is urban fantasy with the paranormal aspects as well, magic users, the spellcasters, are very much on the fringe of society. They're the outcasts. They're the ones who are looked down upon. they're the ones who have that struggle and get used and use each other towards their own ends. So I definitely explore it in that aspect, not necessarily the technology, but yeah, I definitely try to work in that aspect of the discussion as well. Yeah.
Yeah. And your main character is a technomancer and an inventor.
He is, and I should point out I never really set out to write steampunk with this book. It was not part of the original plan. But by making my main character a technomancer who was fusing magic with technology in the 1880s, it really just kind of opened up that question, well, what would happen to the technology if it's being enhanced with magic? And that's how the steampunk element got into my book in the technological sense. Once I accepted that fact, it just really kind of became more and more and more of a thing as I went along. But it wasn't how I started out my first draft, no.
Well, that's awesome. I love that it's like an organic growth of the steampunk element, which is so rooted in technological aspects. So like you have both the best of both worlds going on in your book. So Emily,
Right.
let's move on. Let's move on to you. Same question. Do you utilize steampunk as a narrative device as well as an aesthetic one in your storytelling?
So a lot of what Clayton was saying actually really resonated with me and the story elements in my book as well. The Clockwork Cyborg, which I call biomatons, they are slaves in my world. And so Taryn being a biomaton, but also wanting to be a mechanic and wanting to be more, has to hide what she is every day in order to be accepted into the parts of society that she is working in. And so you really have that stratified layers of the Clockwork Cyborgs are like the lowest of the low, and they're not considered human. And it's about how do you deal with that? And there might be some rebellion in there.
Yeah, that also really resonates, I think, with like what Chris was saying, and then also like tying back with what Clayton was saying, but like how it's the punk element of steampunk. So I think that it's really interesting that you all really resonate with that sort of socio-political element of steampunk, especially because that can be something that can rift the steampunk fandom or whatever you want to call it, people that are interested in the literature, the aesthetics, sartorial choices, all of those things. So in line with that previous question, do you feel that steampunk is a way to escape present realities, or is it a method of exploring the current circumstances, including those sociopolitical elements? Do you think that it's okay to just be that escapist aesthetic reality, or do you think that it necessitates having that punk element in steampunk? Let's start with you, Emily.
I know when I started writing Sedition, I didn't set out to write any kind of social commentary or any socio-political book. I was writing this escapist fantasy for myself from one scene I had in my head of this kid with a clockwork mask, which didn't end up in the actual book anywhere. It got cut fairly early on, but I think as I explored more of the genre and as I read more of the genre, I realized that steampunk is a really great space to use to talk about things that are hard to talk about in a more realistic space, maybe. I think sometimes it's easiest for us to take something to a fantasy parallel to then say, okay, let's talk about this thing, but in a way that is a little easier than talking about it in real life. And so I found myself exploring these ideas that I saw in the real world, but wasn't sure how to discuss with other people yet. So I think steampunk's a really great way to do that. And going back to that punk word, like, I love my punks. I also write cyberpunk and diesel punk, and just being able to like get into the grittiness of that, I think the genre really allows for that.
Yeah, for sure. And I love that you started from such a place that wasn't tied to that socio-political commentary, and that it did give you a voice. I think that's such a wonderful exploration as a writer, to be able to explore your own writing in that way. So I love that. I love how you phrased that and how you brought that to this book. That's super awesome. Clayton, how about we go to you next for that same question?
I think escapism is fine. I love my popcorn books. I love my popcorn fantasy. I think with steampunk and just kind of hitting on a couple things here. One, Chris has mentioned specifically of punk itself, and then you kind of bringing up the sartorial thing. One of the things that's fairly common from what I've run across in steampunk is when we have heroines, they are dressed in trousers, or there were so many rules with clothing in the Victorian era, and one of the big ones was dresses just didn't have pockets.
They still
So
don't.
Right. So for a woman to actually have pockets, to, whether she's wearing trousers and she's kind of bucking that gender convention, or for her dress to have armor plating and some sort of generator inside it, any of those things are still a kickback against culture, even if they're very cool. It's still that punk aesthetic that clings to it and kind of informs that political thought, I think.
Yeah, that's a super good point. Like the way that we dress, even in our reality as we have it now, the way that we dress and the way that we present ourselves, whether that be gender nonconforming or we are punks or various other things that we can express in our sartorial choices, do make political statements. And so I think that's an excellent point. Like you are making a political statement in steampunk by choosing these elements, by choosing to be technologically advanced or having armor or wearing trousers. So yeah, like thank you so much for bringing that up. And Chris, how about to you?
Yeah, I definitely think. Well, I mean, steampunk, like all subgenres of science fiction and a lot of fantasy, has always kind of explored social issues through a different lens. Like Emily was saying, it does provide a different context for discussing these issues somewhat indirectly, and that's not a new thing to be doing that in steampunk or science fiction. It's been part of the genre since probably before the genre even had a name. I always think back to the X-Men comics of the 1960s. They introduced mutant superheroes, but it was really a way for the creators to talk about what was going on with race issues in the United States back in the 1960s. And, clearly we're still seeing a lot of those issues today. So, yeah, science fiction, steampunk, and various literary, film, even comic book and video game genres have always provided that sort of avenue for discussion of those issues. And maybe it's a way to get people thinking about certain things, start the conversation in a different way that they may not be open to through other avenues. So it does have value in that way, I think.
Yeah, for sure. And I agree with all of you. And also I agree with Clayton that there is totally room for the bubblegum candy version of the steampunk. I really appreciate that all of you do take this like very granular look and approach to both your writing and also the genres that you're writing in. I think that that's super cool, and thank you for sharing that with us. So along with that theme, being granular about your own writing, all of your stories have very dark elements to them. Clayton, you mentioned that this person, Arthur, your main character, is literally bound to Mr. Black via this heart. Clayton, you have this whole, or Chris, I'm sorry, you have this whole cabal of necromancers that are this shady underworld element, and there's murders and bodies everywhere. Emily, you have this element of slavery and these clockwork cyborgs and the struggle of your main character in wanting to be more than what she was born into, wanting to be a mechanic and going to this school for mechanics. So, do you think that steampunk by necessity is a dark subgenre? does it lend itself particularly well to exploring these types of themes? And Clayton, this time we'll start with you.
I don't know if I'd say that it's by necessity dark, but I think since the beginning it's been dark. Vern with Captain Nemo, the man was insane. H.G. Wells, the stuff the Morgoths, all of that, but very very dark stuff. And Alan Moore, Michael Moorcock, those guys just kind of brought it into the forefront as decades went on. So I don't know. I think there are definitely, if you're going to look at it as a whole, when you're looking at, not just the political parts, but the technology and everything else, I think there is something to be said about that kind of underlying layer of darkness that goes along with it. So.
Yeah, that grittiness that's there, even in just how things appear. Like there's a patina.
Yeah.
Chris, let's move to you next.
Yeah, I definitely agree that it's not dark and gritty of necessity, the genre as such, but it's a lot more fun when it is. It's more fun to read. It's more fun to write. If there's not a dead body, what's the point?
Right.
And now the police are coming. But yeah, I mean, it's ultimately it is. I read and I write to entertain. So yeah, it's more fun to explore a gritty milieu than roses and everyone's happy and shiny, and there has to be some conflict. So yeah.
I am now picturing like steampunk, the My Little Pony version. Like
I'm sure it's out there.
I'm sure it is. But yeah, like just
You'll
the
find
contrast.
it.
It's like, what is the first thing that comes that can be the most exact opposite of what you're describing? And that was the thing that popped into mind. So Emily, how about you? Do you think that steampunk is dark by necessity, or does it just lend itself particularly well to that?
I don't think it's dark by necessity. I've certainly seen a manga, steampunk manga, that was like the most bubblegum pink thing you've ever read. So like it has its moments where it's bright and colorful and cheerful, but I think aesthetically you see most of the art and the costumes and things have that grittiness to them already. And then again, when we're talking about the punk tag, that lends to itself as well. And I think it's definitely more fun when you have that darkness that you can play with and you can look at from a different lens and say, okay, well, what would that look like? And the Victorian period was very dark as well. So I think that lends itself too, that we have this like Victorian underpinning, Victorian inspiration where like it was very repressed and a lot of it was very dark. And if you weren't upper class, your life really sucked. And it was dirty and stinky, and London had these terrible fogs where you couldn't even see because it was so thick with the smoke and the fog mixing together. And so I think it just like lends itself to that so well. Why wouldn't you write something that's a little on the darker side?
Yeah, for sure.
Sorry.
That's okay. Did you want to add something?
Yeah, I wanted to add one thing. I keep catching the Dalek on Chris's bookshelf there.
Oh yeah.
And I wanted to kind of note that I think Doctor Who has strong. Right. Awesome. I just kind of wanted to note that I think Doctor Who has some strong roots in steampunk, and I think that's a good example of this portion of the conversation that. It's seen as somewhat goofy, but it does have very dark themes. But at the end of the day, it's always hopeful, and I think that's one thing that
Yeah, for sure. And it's like a pop cultural phenomenon, so that's like a point of reference for a lot of people. But like, yeah, totally. Like with the Daleks or the sonic screwdriver or the Cybermen, you have that technological element to the Whoverse. But then you have like Donna being sung for eternity by the Ood. And like that just is heartbreaking, and it really explores like a lot of elements of grief what it means to be remembered, what it means to liberate. And I think that you're absolutely spot on in tying that into how you have all been talking about steampunk. So let's move it away from the political element a little bit, because we have like riffed on that pretty hard. So I just would like to explore a little bit about how each of you discovered steampunk. What was your introduction to steampunk? Chris, I'll start. Or I'm sorry, you guys have C names, and I'm like my grandmother apparently. Like I'm just gonna call each of you by the wrong name every time. Clayton, let's start with you because you brought up H.G. Wells and Jules Verne and Moorcock and Alan Moore. All of those people, they're pretty much classic. Grandfathers of steampunk as a genre. So how did you get introduced to steampunk?
Yeah, that was actually my introduction. H.G. Wells and Jules Verne. I don't remember what age, but fairly early on, my mother went out and found just a whole collection of basically modern classics, and I sat there and I read through them all. And that was really my first introduction. And again, with Doctor Who, I remembered sitting down with my dad and watching it on CBC when it was on, because we didn't get it locally, so we had to watch it on Canadian television, which we did get in Michigan, so ironically. But yeah, that was my big introduction. And then as I went, I discovered the other authors. So,
do you remember what the first story was that you read?
I know War of the Worlds.
Oh yeah, that's a good one.
Yep.
A good one to start with. Grabs you. Emily, let's move to you. What was your introduction to steampunk?
And Sherlock Holmes is like a precursor, but I think Sherlock Holmes was like my first real dig my fingers into that aesthetic and that whole idea of exploring that kind of a world. And then I discovered just like the costumes on Pinterest. And I was like, oh, what is this? I'm interested in whatever this is because it's beautiful and I'm a theater kid and I'm into it. And then the Leviathan trilogy by Scott Westerfeld really cemented that in for me. And after that, I really started to dig deeper into the steampunk genre and go, okay, what is this? What can I do with it?
That's awesome. I'm really glad that you came to it too, sort of from this opposite end. We had Clayton with like this classic, this is the foundations of steampunk, and you're like, I'll come at it from the aesthetic angle so that we're well-rounded. And Chris, how about you? How did you become?
Well, the first thing I ever found that could be considered steampunk was actually a comic book. It was in the 90s, a comic series called Mr. Hero, the Pneumatic Man. It was created by Neil Gaiman, but he never actually wrote the comic himself. He just came up with the idea, and then it was written. I can't remember who actually ended up writing the comic, but basically what it is, it's a Victorian automaton is found inside a crate in a museum of stage magic, and he doesn't have a head, but the woman that finds him finds his head in a pawn shop and puts them together, and he comes to life. And then he has another head, so he's got swappable heads. There's, I think the two heads were called the Pugilist and the Ratiocinator, or Ratiocinator. So there was the fighter and then the brains. So depending on which head he was wearing at the time, he would kind of do different things. And I picked it up because at the time, I'd finished reading Neil Gaiman's The Sandman comics, and anything with his name on it was something that I would read at the time. So that was the first thing that I found that could probably be called steampunk, and it just cemented it for me back then.
Excuse me while I add that to my Goodreads to read shelf. I
Yeah,
have not read that one.
The first were fantastic, but I've actually been rereading them over the last few weeks, and it quickly got not so good.
Well,
starting out really strong.
Well, we'll just read the first few then. So let's move on. What drew you to this particular aesthetic? Do you have any particular influences outside of that? Any aesthetic influences outside of the books that you have read? Chris, let's start with you again.
Well, where I live in Calgary, there's it's like a theme park museum area called Heritage Park, And Calgary is notorious for knocking down any building older than 25 years old. But they have preserved several, I'm going to say turn of the century, but it's turn of the last century. So late 1800s, early 1900s. They've essentially taken all these buildings and put them all in one spot. And you visit it, and it's like a historical theme park. And that was one of my family's favorite places to go when I was a kid. We would go there frequently and walk around, and they have reenactors walking the streets in period costume, and they had steam trains going around a track in the park that you could get on and ride. And they even have a paddle boat that goes around the lake there. So it was very much that's where I think my fascination with things Victorian came from.
That's awesome. That sounds so idyllic. Clayton, how about you? Did you have any influences outside of those books? Any aesthetic influences or film that you drew from?
You don't run across a lot of that stuff in North Dakota. So I'm gonna have to say probably the comics I ran across. Mike Mignola, Hellboy, Amazing Screw on Head, Joe Occult were all kind of big influences on my love for that sort of mixture of occult and steampunk. So
Awesome. How about you, Emily? You mentioned Pinterest and the aesthetic aspect. So was there anything that particularly drew you to it? Or that you utilized as an influence in your writing?
Yeah. I love like original art and concept art in particular. So the people who just like draw things and post them on the internet, that blows my mind because I have to like look at something to be able to recreate it. So there was a lot of things from that I pulled from. And I think when I first started writing these books, my friend was also writing a Victorian set play, but hers was very strictly like realism, like Jane Austen's kind of a story, and I was like the complete opposite direction. I was like, I'm gonna just play with all the technology that didn't exist at the time and see what happens. And then there's a French film called The City of Lost Children.
I love that
film.
film.
I don't think anything really ended up in my book, but it's definitely an influence that film is so weird and I love it so much.
Yeah, I also really love that film. It's really wonderful. Highly recommend to everybody. Well, awesome. So then I want to move from that influence piece to what it actually is in your novels. So like, what was your favorite element about that you incorporated into your writing? I see lots of thinking faces, so we'll give it a second. Anybody can chime in when you think of something.
I think mine's probably the easiest. The heart, the Clockwork Heart was easiest for me, or probably my favorite piece. Mr. Black has kind of all these little devices, lenses you can see other places and other times through. Basically, a backpack bomb and these brass golems that unfold. But the heart really kind of just once I had the idea, I built the entire book around it. So.
Yeah, I mean, it is so central to the Infernal Machine. So like for me, that resonates as like my favorite piece of the book as well, but you imbued it with so much importance that it really does carry that importance through the book and how you tell the story. How about anybody else? Anybody else ready?
There's in my book, there's a alchemical procedure that I've come up with called elemental bonding. The idea is that a technomancer can use a trapped elemental spirit with a piece of technology and fuse them together to either create something new or just to enhance that piece of technology. So, for instance, he builds a glider backpack that has a Zephyr fused to it, so it'll fly better. But one of his inventions is also a revolver that's fused with a lightning elemental. And the idea the idea he had was that it would use a small blast of electricity to incapacitate people like a taser, um, but it's way too overpowered. It can take down trees, it can blast holes in the sides of buildings. So I don't use it's not a central part of the story, but it's probably the most fun part of the story. Was writing scenes where that comes into play. And spoiler alert for book 2, it comes back into play there as well.
Oh, awesome. That's exciting. I also never would like to be at the receiving end of a blast from one of those. So just note. Emily, how about you? What was your favorite element?
This is gonna be so basic because it's so huge for the steampunk genre, but the airships are my favorite element of, and I've written all 3 of the books in the series, at least first draft. But like anytime I get to talk about an airship and the way the engines work and the way they have these giant hydrogen balloons and they look like pirate ships and they fly through the air, and I just get so excited. There's probably about a third of Sedition is set on an airship and the things that go on there and the way it's like a pirate ship, but it's in the sky. And so exploring that world is so much fun.
Yeah, that's super awesome. I know that when I found out that the Empire State Building had been designed so that airships could moor to it, I was obsessed with that. Like, why do not we not live in this reality that was planned for? Like, thanks a lot, Hindenburg, for exploding. I mean, sad, but we could have had airships. so, so with that being said, when you were writing the book, what kind of research did you do to come up with these mechanics that you just talked about? So you have these favorite elements. And Emily, we'll talk with you because we were just talking about airships.
Yeah.
So go ahead and talk about what kind of research you did to bring all of those elements together.
Yeah, so my book is set in 1864, and a lot of writing, and this is like fantasy, so much of the technology I put in there would never have been possible at the time, but so much of it is doing research into what technology was possible at the time and making sure it's grounded in that, even throwaway lines, like, at one point, one of my characters is like, "Oh, take a photograph, you'll remember me better." And I'm like, "Okay, but did they have photographs?" And so then I have to go and research that and make sure that is accurate. So all of the technology I created is based on actual things that existed at the time, and then I've just warped them to fit my own needs. So they were building these amazing automatons out of clockwork at the time, and I just went, okay, but what if they had enough knowledge of the human body to fuse that clockwork with the human body and create prosthetics for themselves and create mind control with clockwork. So a lot of it is just like taking stuff that already existed and then adding my own imagination and spin to it.
Yeah, that's super awesome. I love this idea of the Clockwork Cyborg because we get a lot of cyborgs in science fiction, but not so much with this like very mechanical element and how you use mechanics to actually simulate mind control. That's super intriguing. I love that. Chris, I saw you nodding along again. Go ahead and speak to that.
I definitely kind of had to do the same thing as Emily, where I had to fudge technology a bit at times to make it fit the story. And I could always kind of fall back on, okay, there weren't light bulbs in wide usage quite yet, but they were on the horizon. So in this story, oh, Thomas Edison was a wizard too, so he was able to come up with light bulbs a little bit faster. Sure, let's go with that. So it definitely a lot of playing with the timeline of technology. I think it's in chapter 2 of my book. The mystery is kicked off with what I call an autotype machine. It's something the size of a desk. It's basically a word processor that uses a typewriter, which wasn't quite a thing yet in 1881, but also uses a memory cylinder made with a piece of brain tissue in a fluid suspension, which clearly didn't exist in 1881 either. So establishing that early in the book, that there's different things going on with technology that weren't a thing quite yet, and also never were. Gives you a lot of freedom to play around with the timeline.
Yeah, for sure. And I actually really love that imagery too of the brain suspended in fluid as like a memory device for the typewriter. Like that's super creepy, but also really like just like awesome to think about. Like how we think about memory in computers now, transposed to a very literal representation visually.
That was a lot of fun to play with, but yeah, I'm not going to say anything else about
Yeah,
it because
for
it's
sure.
central to the story.
And Clayton, how about you? What was your research process for this?
That would assume I have a research process.
Woo!
I mostly just the stuff I'm not entirely sure on, I look up and then I fudge a little bit. I most of it's the occult. I knew the Thule were a secret society within the Nazi Party. I believe their actual existence was a few decades before the time I said them. Same thing with when I stuck Ava in the neighborhood that is kind of this little purgatory of the 1950s. I want to make sure she was at least wearing the right clothing. Little things like that. As far as anything else, Arthur's Heart was basically just my idea of what if they took the Jarvik artificial heart and did something horrible with it. So.
And something horrible they did do with it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, we are actually approaching our 45-minute mark. So I just want to ask you guys one last question before we open the floor to some questions from our viewers.
Sure.
And that will just be, aside from your fabulous books, of course, do you have any recommendations for a book or a film within the steampunk genre that your readers should go out and enjoy in tandem with reading your books? Because everybody read their books. How about Clayton? We start with you.
Yeah. I'm going to kind of slide sideways here and go more on the horror side of things. And I'm probably going to mangle her last name because I've never said it out loud, but Quemby Olsen Eisenacher wrote a book called The Half Killed. It's Victorian, it's horror, and it's fantastic. So if you get the chance to read it, it's very much probably one of the better independent novels I've read in a long time.
Awesome. I have not read that one. I'm looking forward to picking that up. Chris, how about you?
Well, I'm going to recommend a film, actually, rather than a book. Dark City, released, I want to say 1998, 99, somewhere around there. It was directed by the same director who directed The Crow, starring Rufus Sewell. It's steampunk-ish, but also noir, maybe deco punk and diesel punk all mixed into one. There's dark forces at work on the underside, and the city changes every night while people are asleep, and nobody remembers except for our main character, who's caught up in the thick of it. And it's just a fantastic, fantastic movie that I kind of think everyone should watch.
Awesome. I also have not seen that one, so I feel like I am super uncultured in steampunk. And now I have things to learn. Emily, how about you?
I'm gonna offer the Leviathan trilogy by Scott Westerfeld. It's diesel punk, not steampunk. 19 teens, World War I, but alternate history with mechs versus biological engineering. And it's super awesome. The illustrations are amazing, and Westerfeld is one of the authors that like made me want to be an author. So just anytime I can recommend him, I'm like, go read Scott Westerfeld. He's amazing. Don't read it in tandem with my book though, because he's a way better writer than me.
So like, give it some space. That's the order from Emily. So I'm actually going to give a recommendation as well because none of you mentioned them, and since I'm moderating, I can. I'm going to recommend The Diamond Aged, or A Young Lady's Illustrated Primer by Neil Stephenson. Neil Stephenson is one of my favorite authors, and he incorporates some really amazing steampunk elements into that. And not only what we talked about with the socio-political stuff in terms of addressing our own reality, but really pointing to the rigid hierarchy of class and rules in Victorian England. So I think you all guys will all enjoy that if you haven't read it. So
Cool.
Definitely, yeah.
I'm gonna go ahead and open the floor for some questions. Do any of our viewers have any questions for our authors? So we have a question from the Evil Prophet. Is steampunk a genre you'll continue to explore? If so, have you started writing anything new? Chris, let's start with you.
Yeah, definitely. I'm working on a sequel to the Nightshade Cabal right now. I'm planning more books in the series as well. I'm hoping to write about 5 books in this series. The second book is a little less steampunk and goes a little more heavily into the urban fantasy. But then the third book is going to be super steampunk. But yeah, I'm definitely writing more steampunk. Yeah.
Awesome. Clayton, how about you?
I am currently working on a series with a with another author that is probably better described as whale punk. Basically, they get most of their oil or energy needs from rendered fat from megafauna. So
Awesome. I am not familiar with that, so I'm going to have to check out that series. That's an awesome new twist on punk fantasy. Emily, how about you?
Yeah, so I have 2 more books planned in the Children of Erickson trilogy, 2 more books after Sedition. And then I have this idea in my head of having a spin-off novel about 2 of the characters from the trilogy go and do their own thing. And that one's going to be much more just sort of adventurous and lots of pirates and in the air warfare. And so I started writing that, but it's just an idea in my head.
Well, that's awesome. Do you think that the Clockwork Mask will have space to make an appearance?
Maybe.
All right, we have a question. Oh, we have a recommendation from Mike Feeney. Snow Crash, if you want some cyberpunk, also by Neil Stephenson. Again, highly recommended. I agree with that one. He has a question for you all. Which fictional character would you love to see your main character team up with? Clayton, let's start with you.
Oh man. Considering where the Infernal Machine sits, I'm gonna have to go with Eric Carter. He's a necromancer from Stephen Blackmore's Eric Carter series, urban fantasy, but he's just a fantastic series of books.
Awesome. Emily, how about you? Who would you want your character to team up with?
Love to see Taryn team up with Lila Bard from the Shades of Magic series by V.E. Schwab. Lila is similar to Taryn in a lot of ways and also the opposite to her in a lot of ways. I think they would fight a lot and there would be a lot of stabbing.
Yeah, I mean, Lila is known for her knives, so
yeah,
that's super fun. Chris, how about for you?
Well, in a lot of ways, when I first started writing this book, my main character, Isaac Barrow, I patterned him, in the early drafts anyway, I patterned him on Sherlock Holmes as portrayed by Jeremy Brett in the Granada series from the 1980s or so. So it would be interesting to see Isaac Barrow team up with Sherlock Holmes, but I think they would hate each other. I really don't think those 2 would get along at all. They both think they're the smartest guy in the room at all times, and they're both right. So it would be a fun team up to write, but I don't think it would work at all.
I think that it's really funny that you say that because, like, yes, they would have a hard time fitting both of their opinions of themselves into one space. But I'm also just picturing, now that you brought that up, like, imagine Watson in between the two, like trying to manage that situation. um, would be entertaining.
Yeah, and actually, in my very first draft, way back, thrown away years ago now, there was a character named Pendleton who was very much a Watson stand-in, and he was a fun character to write too. But I cut him. He's on the cutting room floor years and years ago. But yeah, he might have to show up for that crossover as well.
Yeah, Watson and Pendleton can team up to control their smart investigative superiors. Well, let's see here. The Evil Prophet has a question for you all. What's a message you want your readers to walk away with after reading your novels? Emily, let's start with you. Take your time. No pressure.
I think, and this is not going to be like a concise, here's one sentence of what you should take away walking away from my book, but I think I would like the reader to more closely examine the way they view other people by the time they're done reading my book.
That's super
And
great.
particularly maybe people that they haven't looked at before, maybe the people that they would consider less than them in the world. Yeah, hopefully you take a better look at the people around you by the time you finish.
That's a super worthy goal. Chris, how about for you?
I think one of the themes that I explore in the book is the way that new technologies and can be put to really diabolical uses by people with bad motivations. So yeah, I think we can definitely see aspects of that when it comes to social media and media manipulation in the current socio-political everything. So that would be one of the things I would want people to take away. Always think about how technology, yeah, it's great and it makes our lives faster, easier, more fun, but also the way that it can be used maybe against us.
For sure. That's awesome and insightful. Thank you. And Clayton, how about you?
Mine is I suppose if I had to distill it into something, it would probably be as human beings, we make terrible choices on a regular basis. Ideally, there's always a chance to turn that around. It's never too late to reverse the course that you've chosen.
That's super awesome. So you've taken steampunk and turned it into hope punk.
That's the first time I've been accused of that.
Well, that's a really hopeful message. We always have the opportunity to turn it around.
Everyone loves a redemption story.
Yes, everybody loves that. All right, we have another question from Cindy. If your book was adapted for a film or for television, who would you want to play your main character? Anyone can jump in as soon as you think of something. I'm going to set aside the formalities.
Still have not dreamcasted my main character. I have not seen anyone yet that I'm like, yes, that's her. But I do have my villain dreamcasted, and I'd like Liam Neeson to play him.
Awesome. I like it. Take him out of his heroic Taken role and put him in a villain.
Yeah, he was a villain in Batman Begins.
Oh yeah, that's true.
So I know he can do it. I know he can be that scary.
All right, anyone else?
There's a show called Billions, and there's an actor, he's not one of the main characters, but there's an actor on it named Stephen Kunkin, and he plays a character called Ari Spiros, but physically he basically looks the way that I think Isaac Barrow would look. He just has the perfect face, and I think he's got the mannerisms. He could play the part. He might be a little old at this point, but if we're setting aside aspects of time and feasibility, he'd be the guy.
Nice. Also, Who doesn't love like an older hero? Clayton, how about you? Do you have anybody in mind?
I thought I did. I usually just cheat and I go with Carl Urban because he seems to fit every role.
There you go. Start with a good template. Awesome. Let's see here. We have a comment from Mike again. The classic lethal weapon duo. Someone who has to be the wild card. Someone has to be too old for this shit. I'm sorry. Am I allowed to curse on my own stream? I guess I make the rules. Bleep. Anyway, that looks like, unless we have any more questions come in, it looks like we can wrap that up. Thank you, audience members, so much for all of your questions. That was awesome. And thank you so much, all of our panelists, for being with us today. I enjoyed hearing your thoughts on your books and on steampunk as a genre so much. So I just want to go over your books one more time. Everybody, check them out. They're really wonderful. I can highly recommend them beyond my own bias for working with these wonderful people. So we have The Infernal Machine by Clayton Snyder. That came out on January 21st, 2020. We have The Nightshade Cabal by Chris Patrick Carolyn. February 25th, 2020 is when that book came out. And Emily Wright has Sedition, the first in the Children of Erickson series, that is coming out on May 18th, 2021. So be sure to keep an eye out for that. Thank you again so much, you guys.
Well, thank you for having us.
Thank you.